All right, so we will now hear about Eusebius and the Eusebii by Lane. Okay, introduction.
And appendices. I skipped over. I've listed appendices, but I skipped over them.
All right.
The intro is much more interesting. So, who was Eusebius? So, Eusebius was one of the early Christian authors. His name comes from a Greek word meaning pious. And he is specifically Eusebius of Caesarea, as we just mentioned, because there's a lot of Eusebiuses, just like there are a lot of John Smiths. Same way that there are a lot of actually Jesuses in the New Testament. Jesus of Nazareth is the person we know as Jesus Christ. So Eusebius was most likely born in around, I think, 260 to 280 AD. It's not known who his parents or his ancestors are, but it was known that he was educated by Pamphilus, who was a relatively well-known teacher back in the, I guess it would be 3rd century AD. So he was imprisoned under Diocletian persecution, which we learned about a while back. You know, it was more of a sort of wholesale persecution against the Christians as opposed to like the radical torture-style persecution. I mean, there's plenty of torture, but the focus was more getting rid of Christianity. And he lived, actually, to see Constantine enact the Edict of Toleration in 313, which was crazy to him at the time to go from this like radically different style of Roman government. And he was actually, if you read his writings, he's absolutely convinced that it was like a miracle or something that had happened. So his writing sort of deals with the transition of early Christianity from New Testament writing to post-New Testament writing, or what every Christian did right after the New Testaments were compiled, or at least everyone had sort of a version of a New Testament. Not necessarily, I think, fully canonized, but at least like everyone more or less had this understanding of Christianity as told in the New Testaments and the Gospels. So Eusebius wrote to fill in the blanks of the post-New Testament Christian world. He wrote his church history, which has a different name I'll talk about later. He wrote apologetic works and historical works and doctrinal works. And the apologetic works, I think, are the coolest because it's kind of him calling people out all the time, being mean to people who disliked Christianity. I think, didn't he also, I can't remember if it was in this because I haven't prepared for this for a while, but didn't he also write a defense of Christianity against it being called an atheist religion, I believe? That was the most interesting thing, that Christianity was accused of being an atheist religion. So, the books of church history, it's one, but it was kind of done in 10 parts. It was called the Ecclesiastices Historias. What?
Sorry, I just thought about something you just said.
So, okay. So this, the church history begins with the life of Jesus Christ. And then sort of ramps off from there. Books 2 through 7 describe the growth of Christianity after Christ's death and resurrection, and books 8 deal with the horrible persecution under Diocletian, and it's most of the focus on Diocletian because that's actually the time that Eusebius was alive for most of the persecution. And book 9 is the sort of a mini biography of, not mini, but definitely a sort of biography of Constantine, the great Christian victor, who I think Eusebius might be a little more kind to Constantine and what he thinks is Christianity than other people were. I've heard some like controversial things that maybe Constantine didn't really know what he believed, but he liked Christianity. I'm not sure either way, but definitely Eusebius kind of has a, I wouldn't say idle view of him, but he likes him a lot. And then book 10 is sort of Eusebius's hope that from then on it would just be toleration and peace throughout the Roman Empire. Some people have called this like early Christian progressivism, like just presuming that like, oh, everything's going to be great from now on because the Roman Empire is going to be Christian. I don't think he really thought like that. I think he had sort of a more realistic understanding of how bad things could get, but you do you. He also wrote a bunch of other historical writings. He wrote about his mentor, actually, the life of Pamphilus. He wrote The Martyrs of Palestine, collection of ancient martyrdoms. He liked to talk about martyrs. And like I mentioned before, the life of Constantine. This was actually more of a biography than the Book 9 of the church history. And his apologetic works, I can't remember which one of these this is, but I think this is actually includes one of them that were defending against Christians being called atheists. But his apologetic works mostly were detailing how Christianity actually functioned to people who might not understand what Christianity is. Because there was a lot of people who were kind of weird about Christianity. They made up things about it, or they had huge misconceptions. Like, I believe it was Pliny the Younger thought that Christians worshipped like the decapitated head of a donkey and ate babies. But, so it was really important back in the day to be a Christian apologist and say, no, we don't do that. He also wrote a bunch of doctrinal writings, which are important in the sort of showing that we do actually have a pretty solid basis in understanding Christianity, that we didn't add just a bunch of rules without a good reason. So the general elementary introduction, I think that's also, once again, the life of Christ and the doctrine of Christ. Like I said, it provides a summary of the messianic tradition of the New Testament and how that sort of connects to the Old Testament and uses prophecy to show, oh yes, this Christ was the Messiah that was talked about according to like ancient Hebrew prophets. Oh, and the Paschal Festival. This is really interesting because I think we talked about this briefly, but for a long time they weren't sure when to celebrate Easter, and that actually was causing breakups in the church. And I think he wrote more of a sort of neutral opinion on that. I don't think he was radical, like, oh, if you celebrate Easter on this day, you're a heretic and you're not going to heaven. I don't think he was that upset about it. And his other writings were actually kind of more apologetic writings, but they're still pretty useful. Like the Bible dictionaries thing, I thought that was really interesting. It explains a lot of the terms used in ancient biblical literature. I actually wanted to kind of get one because that sounds like it would be useful for this class, actually. Orations and, of course, letters. I wonder if he would be happy knowing that we were peeking into his personal letters, but still, those are cool to have. The appendixes, they just provide a brief discussion of some of Eusebius's non-Christian sources and like people who he referred to, which is interesting that he had a list of sources, because I think back in the day it was common, instead of saying, I've sourced my writing from this, you just kind of copied another author. And it was understood that you were sourcing them and not that you were plagiarizing. They had a very different idea of how copying or quoting other works went. So he uses Josephus, the Hebrew scholar, and I think the quote he uses from Josephus is just about the life of Jesus, or that Jesus did exist. But in this quote, he has kind of it's either an unintentional mistranslation, or Eusebius changed it to be more friendly to Christ, because Josephus just sort of neutrally mentioned Christ in an article, but Eusebius made it seem as though Josephus was sort of like a diet Christian, or that he was sort of maybe he accepted Jesus as a rabbi. But I don't think Josephus is really that friendly to Jesus. He probably just, he was some guy. And the later half of the appendix just talks about, a list of bishops and emperors. There's something really interesting here, is that in this list of bishops and stuff, Eusebius isn't mentioned, even though he was made a bishop under Constantine's rule. Maybe that was just a slip-up, or maybe they didn't think to write it because they thought it was self-evident. I don't know. The citations for the first part. But wait.
What?
I still have 2 more to do.
Okay. Well, let me
do a pause.
Let's pause here just for a second. Are there any questions about this? Right. Slavery in the Hellenistic.
It was not very good to be a slave in the early Roman period. It's not usually good to be a slave at any period. I would in fact say it was never good to be a slave. So slaves were viewed as living property in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, and there were a lot of them. 1 in 5 people in in these ancient civilizations were estimated to be a slave. Ugh, yeah. So they were used for a lot of construction and usually worked to death in construction, and they were usually gathered up through war or through exposure, like we learned earlier. If somebody didn't want their infant, they would leave it out, and then a slave trader would take that infant and then sell them. And one of the worst ways was through forced breeding. A lot of times, masters would have slaves procreate and produce more, which is probably why the population was so high after a certain period. It's not a great time. They were treated horribly. Most slaves were considered literal objects. In fact, Aristotle refers to slaves as living tools, though the slavery wasn't necessarily race-based in early ancient Greek and Rome. It was more classist. It was if you were born to this person, or if somebody didn't want you, or if you were captured through war, then you were a slave. And only household slaves were potentially treated well, and often they were also abused or just not living great lives. So, slaves were deprived of 4 traits, and these are the 4 important things that ancient Greek philosophers said, if you don't have these, you are not considered a citizen. You were considered just like property. You had to have representation in legal matters. You had to have protection from illegal seizure. You had to have a right to work, and you had to have the freedom to move throughout the country. If you did not have these, you were considered a slave. If you even had 3 of them, but not the 4th, you would still be considered a slave. Because a citizen would be able to sort of make themselves a notable person, and a slave had to always appeal to whoever their master was in order to have any sort of discussion of what their rights, not even rights, but what their permissions were in the society. But there was the potential to be free from it in manumission. So if a slave was skilled enough as a laborer, like maybe a stonemason or a jeweler, they could potentially be freed if they were able to pay for their own freedom. But this was not an option for most slaves because, once again, most slaves were involved in construction and they were worked to death during construction. So this idea of manumission, though, is also carried over in some early Christian writings that we see. Some of the language used in freeing slaves might have been adopted by early Christians. And the way we see this is in this idea of sacral manumission. So since a slave could not legally represent him or herself, the only way that they could be freed or represented in a court or in a temple was by a deity. And the idea is that a deity, as a slave was being freed, would theoretically come down and answer for the slave in legal matters, and then that's how they were freed. So after the purchase of their freedom, the slave would be considered divinely recognized as a free person. And a lot of temples actually kept logbooks of, yes, on this day, this slave was recognized by this god to be a free person. And the idea is that Christians may have used some of these themes when discussing humanity's liberation from sin through Jesus Christ. And that's sort of just how it connects to the early Christian world. Now I'm going to transition into talking about education. So, there were 2 sort of perceptions about how education worked in the ancient Roman world. It was considered the formation of the human person, I think, by, once again, Aristotle. Or was it Plato? Oh, I'll just say Aristotle. But it was also considered education was also considered lowly because teachers had to beg for students to teach and had to be worked for countless hours.
Some things don't change.
Ouch. So you, at one point, it was great to be educated, but not great to be an educator. So that was sort of this dual reality that a lot of people lived with. So there are 3 main stages of ancient education. There was primary education, which involved memorizing certain things like letters, numbers. Then there was secondary or rhetoric and grammar education. And this was more about learning how those systems worked. So, like, I guess learning an example today would be like learning the conjugations for language, like the endings, to make sure that you're saying something the right way. Or, and finally, the advanced part of education was mastery, showing and being able to defend what you know in a school or in a like widely recognized area. And there's also a lot of physical education during the advanced period, which was interesting to me. That's when a lot of these people used the gyms. So primary usually began when the child was 7, and it kind of was just what we learned today when we're really young. It's reading, writing, and arithmetic, and also just basic memorization skills. Secondary was the grammarian instruction, and it taught liberal arts. It taught occasionally music, but one of the bigger focuses was better mathematical development and learning how to use numbers, I guess, architecturally. And finally, the advanced stage of education was considered the finishing school. One of the biggest parts of this, like I mentioned earlier, was physical education. And at this point, adults were given major access to the gymnasium, where I think they would learn not only how to be strong, but also some military stuff, like a javelin and shot put. These are my sources. Fine. Any questions? Yeah.
On the race idea at the beginning, so to be a Roman citizen, did you have to come from like Italian heritage, or
no? Because remember, Paul was, and he was Jewish.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think what he's talking about is, say, in the United States, we have tended to think of slavery as racially based.
right?
For the ancient world, Greeks and Romans, you could be of any race. Part of it would be, like he said, for example, if your family abandoned you as an infant and somebody found you, they could sell you into slavery. They wouldn't necessarily have to raise you like their own. Another big way, like he said, was warfare. They would conquer people, and then those people often were enslaved. Sometimes depending upon their talents. For example, the Romans enslaved a lot of Greek scholars to mainly be tutors for their children. That kind of thing. Otherwise, the Romans were very particular about classes of people. If you were from a lower class and you got into some kind of financial or legal trouble, sometimes you might end up as a slave. So I suppose two things that are different from what we normally think of. One, it's not just primarily one race or from one place or one general area that people came to be slaves. Secondly, a lot of that slavery that we're accustomed to hear about was agricultural. Theirs wasn't so much agricultural because they had a lot of peasants to do the agriculture, but like you said, construction or specialized skills somebody might have. There's also household slaves. Household slaves typically had the best situation of slaves because they had access, and the family knew them more, they had access to more resources. So they tended to last longer. Any other questions? All right, thank you.